Next up is the Modulator plugin. Before we get started, I need to mention that I will use some synthesis terminology that might be a bit confusing for the complete beginner. I am planning to do some synthesis videos though, where I will explain everything in detail. But for this video, I won't go into detail about what everything is, except for the LFO, which is one of the main tools of this plugin. So let's load up the modulator. And let's actually make it 125%, just a tad bigger. Now, as you can see, it is split into two sections, the LFO and the envelope, both of which can be assigned to any CC, continuous controller, or aftertouch. Now let's start with the LFO section. Now, first of all, what is an LFO? LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. As you may know, an oscillator is the sound source of a synthesizer. Now, this particular type of oscillator, though, is not used like you would expect it. It is a low frequency, hence the name, usually below 20 Hz, so outside the range of human hearing, and it is used to modulate and influence other parameters of the sound. Now, a good example is when you hear a pulsing sound or a vibrato. I'm obviously referring to synths and not acoustic instruments, so vibrato on a synth, and these effects are usually created using an LFO. So let's quickly listen to an example so that you understand it better. So I'll turn the LFO off, and here's the synth sound from Alchemy. And here's with the LFO modulating something, in this case the cutoff. And of course, you can apply this effect to any instrument you load on your software instrument tracks. Now let's look at the parameters. As you have seen at the very top, I can either turn the LFO on or off. Underneath that, we have the waveform shape buttons. We've got triangle, a sine wave, square, and random. And we also get visual representation of the selected waveform in this display here. Now, for all the waveforms except for random, we get the Symmetry Slider. This will deform the waveforms. For example, as it is right now, it is a perfect triangle wave. Now, if I take it all the way to the right, so a value of 1, then it becomes a sawtooth. Actually, let's listen to it as well. And all the way to the left at -1, it becomes a reverse sawtooth. The sine wave becomes something that resembles a sawtooth with peaks, I would say. And when you adjust the symmetry on the square waveform, then you control the pulse width. And on the random waveform, instead of a symmetry slider, we get the similarity slider. This will determine the amount of deviation between two random values on the waveform. In easier terms, the more to the right you go, so closer to the value of 1, the less deviation we have in the random value. So let's listen to it. So as you can see, everything gets closer. And eventually all the way to 1, it's a straight line, so there is no effect. And let's go back to triangle. Now next we have trigger mode. In free, which is the default one, the LFO will ignore all the MIDI messages that are triggered and continue its cycle uninterrupted. Now the best way to understand this is by looking at it. Thankfully, this display down here, which is called the oscilloscope, can do just that. So right now in free mode, no matter what I play, the LFO will continue its cycle and will keep oscillating to the frequency I set it. uninterrupted. So if I select multi, then the LFO will reset each time I play a note. And if I select single, then each time I release the notes that I played, only then the LFO will reset. So if I play legato, you will see that it will reset for the first note and then continue its oscillation for the remainder of the notes. So and then when I release it and play a new note, or play the notes, or not play the notes legato, then it will reset. So now underneath that we get steps per LFO cycle. This is also labeled as smoothing when you're using the square waveform or random. And here you can set the number of steps for each LFO cycle. So look at what happens at the waveform display when I start taking it down. It creates steps. So the less steps, the less smooth it is. So let's try another sound that might be easier to hear the difference. So I've got this one here. Let's use that. So let's actually listen and look at the oscilloscope as well. As you can hear, it sounds very steppy. And if we use the square waveform, it'll make the square wave much smoother. So now next to that, let's actually go back to that one. And let's go back to 3. Now next to that we have rate. Here you can set the frequency of the LFO, how fast you want the cycle speed to be. This can also be modulated by the envelope, but we will look at that a bit later. Now the rate can be synchronized to the project tempo when you click this 8th note here. So when it's yellow, it's synchronized to whatever your tempo is. Or you can change it to hertz. For synchronized, you get bars and you also get note lengths. So let's actually go back to hertz. Next, the pop-up menu down here will allow you to set a CC, continuous controller, aftertouch, or even learn plugin parameters. Now let's look at few examples. So right now it is set to mod wheel, which is also the default setting. So now the LFO will control whatever the mod wheel is assigned to. So if we look at Alchemy, let me actually move this out of the way so we can look at both. So the mod wheel is assigned to the cutoff. So let me turn off the LFO. So by using my mod wheel, I can control the cutoff. And let's also listen to it. If I go back to the modulator and turn the LFO on, you will see that the cutoff from Alchemy is going up and down based on the LFO settings on the modulator. So if I take the rate down a bit, you will see that it will slow down and follow those settings. And of course, since this is MIDI, you can set it to any controller that you want. So, or you can, another cool thing is that you can learn any plugin parameter. So select plugin, learn plugin parameter, and then click on the parameter you want to modulate with the LFO. Now this can be anything. I can use another control. For example, I can use, say, drive. So I simply click on it, and now that is modulated based on the rate of my LFO here. So right now the mod wheel is controlling the cutoff, because that's how it is set up within Alchemy, and the drive is modulated by the Modulator LFO. And of course I can have more than one modulators loaded. So I will load another one underneath the first one. And for this one I am going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to learn plugin parameter, and let's go with cutoff. So now both controls are modulated by the LFO at a different frequency. Alright, so we don't need that anymore. Also, I'm just using Alchemy to demonstrate the examples. It doesn't have to be Alchemy. It can be anything, literally anything. It can be a compressor, an EQ, phaser, whatever. Let's actually look at an example. So let's say we load an EQ, and let's say I want to modulate this band here and go up and down based on the rate of my LFO. So I will click here, learn plugin parameter, and I will simply click on that. And I will go up and down based on the rate. Let's actually mess with the Q a bit. There you go. A few more decibels. Let's make it slower and let's play it. And as before, you can also load another modulator and then control something else. Let's say you also want the volume to do this. Let's actually try it. So, modulator, learn plugin parameter, and let's do the volume. So it can be, really, it can be anything. Okay, let's turn that off. So there are lots of things to explore and experiment with. Now let's move on to the next part. So let's actually go back to the mod wheel, which is on the cutoff. Right, so the next part is the output level. Now this slider will determine the LFO output, so meaning the volume. If you listen to the sound as I take the output level down, the initial sound from the synthesizer does not go down in volume. But as I take it down, the volume of the LFO, and in this case the pulsing, will become quieter. I have an LFO on first. So in this case, I can control how strong the pulsing effect will be. Now next to that, we have the offset slider. Again, it is much easier to understand this by looking at the oscilloscope. At 0, the LFO cycle is full. It goes from top to bottom. And as I move it up, you can see that it is offset. And with this slider, we can determine either a positive or a negative value. So depending on where we have it, that will greatly influence the sound. So let's actually look at it. Let's take the cutoff down a bit more. And if you look at the cutoff frequency in Alchemy, you see that the range of the knob is following the setting we have here. So if I take it all the way up here, you see that it only goes to like 3 o'clock. If I take it down, it obviously goes lower. Now, as I'm sure you already know, the oscilloscope will display and analyze the waveform. And there's also a hidden menu down here where we can assign the MIDI output channel that we want. And that is actually it for the LFO section of the modulator, and in the next video we will look at the envelope section.